Okay, so our special guest today is Professor Asijit Gontarski. So good morning, Professor Gontarski, and good morning and good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. So let me very briefly introduce the legendary Asijit Gontarski, and I'll try to brief. Okay, so Asijit Gontarski is a Robert O. Lawton Distinguished Professor of English at Florida State University, where he edited the Journal of Beckett Studies from 1989 to 2008. His recent books include, with editors Paul Ardoin and Lacey Mattison, it's called Understanding Bergson, Understanding Modernism, is from Bloomsbury 2013. And the follow-up, Understanding Deleuze, Understanding Modernism, appeared in 2014. His critical bilingual edition, Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire, was published in the series Canon of European Drama from PISA 2012. He has also edited the Beckett Critical Reader, Archives, Theories and Translations 2012, and the Edinburgh Companion to Samuel Beckett and the Arts 2014, both from Edinburgh University Press. His monograph, Creative Involution, Bergson, Beckett, Deleuze, has appeared in 2015 to launch his book series Other Becketts with Edinburgh University Press. From which his Beckett Matters essays on Beckett's late modernism appeared in fall 2016. His Performing Beckett, essays on Beckett, translated by Thomas Wisniewski and Milos Woznia, appeared from the University of Gdansk and the Muskie Press in 2016. His Beckett's Happy Day, a manuscript study, appeared from Ohio State University Press in 2017, originally 1977. And we'll be also discussing his Revisioning Beckett, Samuel Beckett's Decadent Turn, which appeared from Bloomsbury Academic in 2018. His Burroughs Unbound, William Burroughs, and the Performance of Writing is forthcoming from Bloomsbury Academic in 2021. And his Stanislav Staniewski and the Phenomenon of Gadziency, edited by Thomas Wisniewski and Katarzyna Krek-Luaska, I'm sorry with the Polish pronunciation, is in production with Routledge for their theater and performance series, forthcoming 2021. It's such a pleasure to finally have you here on the screen, Professor Gontarski. Yeah, and thank you for agreeing to be part of this interview immediately. So in our discussion today on Samuel Beckett, Disabled Bodies and Impaired Language, we will try to make sense of the broken bodies and linguistic fluctuations primarily in Beckett's plays, and his idea of decadence in Professor Gontarski's brilliantly intriguing book, Revisioning Beckett, Samuel Beckett's Decadent Turn. So if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box, or you can put your video on and ask them directly at the end of the session. Okay, I think we should begin, Professor Gontarski, with the questions. Yeah. Okay, right. So my first question is that your book, Revisioning Beckett, Samuel Beckett's Decadent Turn, intriguingly begins with references to the sociological profiling undertaken by German eugenicist Max Nordau, who considered modern art to be counterproductive and viciously mystical, which staggeringly concludes itself in the gassing of 70,000 psychiatric patients by the Nazis. Then the argument in your book shifts to a detailed understanding of decadence, censorship, banned works, and the emergence of anti-bourgeois and anti-establishment artworks. So what I'm asking is, what is the reason behind linking eugenics and offensive art? That's my first part of the question. And also, do you think this comparison still has relevance, for example, in banning books by governments and gene selection theories?
Yeah, I mean, it is an intriguing question and an intriguing interest. As early as 1931, he's reading Nordau's book on degeneration, on the human species not advancing. His evidence is mostly the turn in contemporary art. All those people we valorize today, from the fin de siècle, Nordau attacks. The symbolist Baudelaire is a particular target of his, and the argument is that human species is in serious decline. Beckett takes extensive notes on this book while he's writing Dream of Fair to Middling Women. So in the 1930s, he's intrigued at least. Now, the question you ask is whether or not there's a carryover from Nordau's discussion of human decline and attempts to stop that decline, which were the unfortunate final solution strategies of the National Socialist government under Adolf Hitler. But those seem to me two separate questions. An interest in where the human species is moving, and whether or not, if it is a decline, whether or not that should be halted and how. Beckett's interest has been in the former, and mostly in Nordau's language. He, like Joyce, often read for material that could help him in his writing. And in the Dream Notebook, he pulls out from Nordau all sorts of really interesting esoteric language that finds its way into certainly more Dream of Fair to Middling Women at first, and then the attempt to salvage that effort in a series of short stories called More Pricks Than Kicks, which finally did get published. Most of the people who've written on this phenomenon, that is Beckett's interest in so odd a book, have tried to link it directly to Dream of Fair to Middling Women and its other version, More Pricks Than Kicks, sometimes in language that's a little suspect these days, calling Nordau a source of that book, or suggesting that it provides a context for that book. To my mind, that's too strong a connection between the two. My own, as I explored this interest, and I continue to do so, I find much more of the analysis of this condition in the post-war period, not in the 1930s, but when Beckett turns attention to the theater, particularly his first produced play, On attendant Godot, and particularly Lucky's speech. In many respects, Lucky has both symptoms of physical anomalies and deteriorating language, a language that is no longer functional for the kind of discourse he's trying to engage in. And I think my current work, and I'm almost sorry to report I'm working on another Beckett book because I find his work inexhaustible. With each of these, I think, okay, I've had my say, and else comes up. One way or another, I keep returning to the point. And part of this book I'm working on now, which is called Bad Godos, we'll see if that title holds, but it's a look at early intervention by people other than Beckett into his texts. part of that discussion has a look at Beckett's redrafting of Lucky's speech in particular. Once he translates Entendant Godot into English, in order for it to be circulated among producers and the like. I mean, we are dealing here in a pre-Xerox era, pre-cut and paste era. So there's always a problem, particularly in the theater, of how one multiplies one's text so that it can be distributed first to producers and then finally to actors, most of whom work from mimeograph copies. So Beckett would do a translation, and then someone, difficult to know exactly who, would send it out to stenographers who would make multiple copies. And these mimeograph copies exist. Some are on the Beckett Digital Manuscript Project. Some are in university libraries, University of Texas at Austin, Ohio State University. But Beckett did a very quick translation at first. Then he revised the translation and said particularly he wanted to work on Lucky's speech. And the kind of changes he makes are pretty interesting. I think the whole principle of an intellectual tradition in decline, about to vanish, which is what Lucky seemed to be an emblem of, and that intellectual tradition in the grasp of monetary forces, capitalist forces, since Pozzo is taking him to market to try to sell this defective product. That whole notion of defect is put in very sort of capitalist terms as Pozzo tries to unload this piece of machinery, which is no longer working. And probably no one will take it the way Apple will no longer accept your outdated iPhones or Apple Watches once they're beyond use anymore. Lucky seems to be one of those products. And what we get is this brilliant representation of this stuttering, defective mind, this intellectual who is beyond his use. Beckett makes several important changes, one of which was the reference to a land where maybe the wrong word, a land where such primitive creatures still exist, undeveloped creatures, the kind of Caliban figures. And the first reference in those early translations is to Alabama, the American state, notorious for its slavery past and its various forms of servitude, some of that which continues today. This was Lucky's reference. Now, why Beckett chose Alabama is anybody's guess, except that Bertolt Brecht in Mahagoni has the Alabama song in it, and Brecht loved the sound of that name, Alabama. So, it finds its way into Beckett's early draft. By the time Beckett revises it, he shifts the territory of undeveloped humanity under intellectualized humanity from the United States, Alabama, to Connaught in Ireland. so that the west of Ireland becomes the seat of this kind of primitivism. But I think, that Lucky speech, to my mind, is really sort of central to Godot. And this comes into play, I think, in particular. I think I can make an argument that Godot himself or herself, for all we know, the Godot is a red herring, that it takes us off into the wrong directions. And that so much early criticism in particular about who is Godot, what does he stand for, what is this all about, I think takes our attention away from the real subject, which is humanity in decline and humanity's principal tool, that is language itself, being in decline. And I'll read you a short paragraph from a draft of that book. Well, Beckett's revisions to the English language Godot affect the overall quality of the translation little. They do sharpen some of Lucky's monologues, which celebrates the growing warning using the brain science of his day, which is phrenology and other sorts of techniques that were very current. That was the current neuroscience of the late 19th century, and Lucky refers to it. Some of the monologue of Lucky's celebrated speech grows to be using the brain science of his day to suggest human degeneration, a slide toward the dystopian, as his speech outlines the theory of not only human stagnation, but of regression, a slide toward atavism, a Darwinism in reverse. Such reversion or degeneration evident in the science of his days in anatomical anomalies, distortions of skulls, faces, and other bodily asymmetries. When Van Hula and Pim Verhulst turned to this material in their book on the making of Godot, they characterized the shift as, quote, the English translation also carries a greater sense of decay. So I continue to explore that notion of decay, which I think is traceable back to Nordau and Beckett's interest in Nordau. So it's less a matter of providing solutions, temporary, permanent, and the like, to what's seen as human atavism, a Darwinism in reverse, then foregrounding it. And a lot of that has to do with the ways in which the body can go wrong and the insufficiencies of language. What we tend to get are both damaged bodies and damaged language. That's a long answer to your question, Asijit.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Gontarski, for your response. So on the one hand, we have this banning of more bricks than kicks, and on the other, we have Beckett's unwillingness to translate Sartre's works. So would it be right to say that Beckett consciously moves to a much more complex and obscure and opaque zone of mind-body problems, which is perhaps a higher form of aesthetic decadence, to avoid the trappings of censorship and defined margins of art? As Herbert Blau writes, we are always looking at a what perhaps should not be looking at.
I think in the questions you sent me, you cited Herb Blau, quotation about theater in particular, focusing on what should not be seen. And you're right to suggest that Beckett was very ambivalent when he received commission to translate the Marquis de Sade, and finally turned down from Jack Kahane, who was Maurice Giraud-Diaz's father, the contract to translate some of the Marquis de Sade, thinking it would damage his professional reputation. I mean, it's an interesting exchange because we tend to think of Beckett as this sort of idealistic writer paying no attention to commercial possibilities of his work or even his career. But if you trace those letters, he's quite interested in preserving his integrity to a larger publishing community. But finally, he does a lot of translations of the Marquis de Sade. Not a whole book, but works diligently for Transition magazine, translating sections and valorizing the Marquis de Sade, very much like most of the French intellectual community in the early part of the 20th century did, proclaiming him one way or another as the freest person in the world. That is, one who is not constricted by any sort of social constraints at all. I don't think we want to defend that reading of the Marquis de Sade, but I will say that you cited some of the books I edited in this series, Understanding Philosophy, Understanding Modernism. And it's a series that's gotten to be extremely popular, and I am one of the general editors of that whole series. But I keep thinking that we need a book on the Marquis de Sade. You know, understanding the Marquis de Sade, understanding philosophy. But I keep resisting doing it myself for any number of reasons. One, I'm not sure I really want to read all that stuff again. It was fine when I was 19 or 20. You know, I thought this was really breakthrough stuff. But I'm not sure I want to reread all of that. But at the same time, you know, I think it would be an interesting angle in this attempts to understand modernism. Beckett certainly would play a major role in that volume, as was books like, you know, Must We Burn Sade, things of that nature, those books that came to the Marquis' defense. So some of the questions about potential pornography, Beckett is finally pretty ambivalent about. You know, not wanting to damage his reputation, but, you know, considering him one of the great philosophers of the 18th century and helping as much as he can, particularly with philosophy of the bedroom or Transition magazine. So on the one hand, you know, we see Beckett as this crusader for anti-censorship, particularly his battles with the Lord Chamberlain in London and England. As we know, all of his early works were banned in his homeland because one of the things that happens to the Irish government in 1922, once they established what was then called the Irish Free State, it becomes stunningly conservative. It becomes essentially a theocracy. And one of the first things it does is not only implement the Vatican's index of prohibited books, but extends that list to all sorts of material, even the material that even mentions contraception in any way at all. So it's not surprising that Beckett's books are quickly put on that Irish list of prohibited books. He doesn't attack that much. He did do battle with the Lord Chamberlain, however, and with Faber and Faber. I think it was not Faber and Faber's greatest hour when it decided to print a censored edition of Waiting for Godot. And Beckett's exchanges with the press thereafter, the press expressed its regret at not having the courage to print the play as Beckett wrote it. I think finally, Beckett decided not to send Fin de Partie, Endgame, to Faber and Faber first because of that failure of courage, and sent it instead to his American publisher, Barney Rossett at Grove Press, so that Grove would handle the world rights in English and not Faber and Faber. But at the same time, you know, Beckett had his own reservations about how all this affects his reputation.
Right. Thank you, Professor Gontarski. So when you write in your book that the text in a performance takes the shape of a body, or the actor's body itself reflects the performative text, so are you explicitly pointing at Beckett's obsession with lessening bodies? So my question is there at all a boundary separating textual bodies, so which are bodies made out of words, which is true for all fiction, let's say, from body texts? So is there a difference between textual bodies and body texts? So body texts, let's say, are texts shunned out of bodies, which I find is essentially Beckettian.
I think there are distinctions we all know, and doubtless we've all written about the deteriorating body over the what's too often called the trilogy, but better called the three novels, where the human form seems to deteriorate over the course of that novel. But the other interesting feature is the truism about theater, that theater is an embodied form of art, and that textual embodiment is the text of theater, not the outline that is the play script that is published. What intrigues me is the ways in which Beckett subverts that notion of theater being an embodied text, since even on stage, some of his bodies, if they're not disappearing, at least have questionable existence. I think we learn by the end of something like Footfalls, for example, that what we see on stage as an embodied figure may not be there, that it may be an apparition, an illusion. And you know, the way in which I think of Entendant Godot, that Godot himself is a sort of red herring and the emphasis should be elsewhere. I keep insisting that with Footfalls, there are 4 acts, not 3 acts. In 3 acts, we have an apparent embodied figure on stage. The 4th act is very short. It is an empty stage. But it's an important commentary on the previous 3 acts, that what we see may not have been there. We look at Ohio Impromptu, you know, I think it's a monumental mistake in the Beckett for television series to have Jeremy Irons play both roles, reader and listener. I mean, it creates a different sort of play. I think the important thing is to try to figure out who's really there and who's not. What we see on stage is not necessarily a corporeal reality. So what I see is Beckett exploring the issues of stage and staging and realities, and moving more and more toward ghosts. I think he found it's easier to explore some of these issues in television than on the stage. The production I did of What Where many years ago, and it's available on YouTube, although it is very much a 1980s technology that's used in that production. It's a 1980s production, but the VCR technology, I'd really like to redo that with an iPhone these days. But the question of who is illusion, who is what is corporeal in these plays. So on the one hand, you have a truism about theater, that it itself is an embodied art, and only until it is embodied does the text become realized. What you have is the equivalent of a recipe for a cake in the play script, but you don't have the cake. That the performance is the cake. And that you have this concrete entity on stage. And yet, we keep undermining that concrete entity. We keep raising questions about what is concrete and what is not, who's there and who is not. And are we playing tricks on the audience? I'll tell you one anecdote, which is when Pierre Chabert, the late Pierre Chabert, one of Beckett's favorite French actors, wanted to adapt the novel Company to the stage in Paris. I was living in Paris then and meeting with Beckett regularly. And one morning over coffee, he tells me, Chabert wants to do this adaptation of the novel. He wants me to come over and look at it. I don't want to go there by myself. You want to come with me? Yeah, I want to come with you. And so we go over to the theater and we watch Chabert's production. And it's pretty stunning because Chabert builds this theater within a theater. He builds this huge box in which the actor, Pierre Dux, a legend in French acting, a mainstay of the Comédie Française, builds this box for Pierre Dux to be in and play both roles. This way, Chabert thought, the lighting would be concealed. You wouldn't see lighting from the theater. It would be mysteriously in this box. Plus, the box was on wheels, so that over the course of the hour, the box with Chabert in it moved from one side of the stage to the other side imperceptibly. The movement was so slow, you could not tell until at some point you say, wait a minute, he wasn't there for the whole play. He was at the other end of the stage. How did he get there? It was brilliant. And Chabert's innovation stunning. After it, Chabert asked Beckett for his comments, and Beckett did his usual hemming and hawing, massaging his eyes for about 10 minutes before he spoke. And the first thing he said was, "Get rid of the box." I didn't like it at all. I didn't press him about what he found objectionable, but my sense is that he thought it was too theatrical. You know, that he just wanted the reading. He also objected to the fact that Dukes wanted to recite live both voices in company. Beckett wanted one of those recorded and that he could listen to.
Right.
Chabert didn't change that. And there's a story that Chabert visits Beckett in the nursing home as Beckett is dying in November of 1989. And he calls Chabert to come closer to him and apparently whispers in his ear, "You should have recorded one of the voices." Evidently, this little bothered Beckett in association with Chabert. I did an American production of that adaptation with Alan Mandel, and we did record the voices. There's a clip of that version on YouTube as well, and you can see Alan listening to that sound. That anecdote may have absolutely nothing to do with the question you asked, Asijit, but I found it irresistible.
They were amazing anecdotes. My next question is, when I'm reading Ruby Cohn's description of Beckett's theater as afflicted bodies, or what you brilliantly describe as spectacles of pain, I cannot help thinking if Beckett intentionally, almost in cold blood, let's say, employs pain as a trope to conjure bodies, so as if to make these fictive bodies more corporeal, more concrete.
And I think this is the issue between concretion and some sort of dissipation. But I've written any number of times that although Beckett denies being a philosopher over and over again, and I agree, he is not a philosopher, even in a Deleuzean sense, although I see him closer to Deleuze, or Deleuze closer to Beckett, than almost any other philosopher. That doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't deal with philosophical ideas. And when Ham says, the old questions, I love the old questions, Beckett does as well. And some of those are fundamental to philosophy. And the one he deals with most overtly in Endgame is the issue of the one and the many, which has to do with the issue of wholeness. If you reject the idea of wholeness itself, you're left with fragments of one form or another. And I think this applies to ontology as well. If you don't see the human entity as a whole, as integrated single entity, that takes you to another series of steps. And I think underlying much of Beckett's fragmentation is this resistance to the idea of wholeness. Ham talks about one of the philosophical points about the relationship of the grains of sand to something called the heap, or grains of millet to something called the heap. It's a standard philosophical conundrum that if you put one grain down, does that qualify as a heap? Well, obviously not. Put another one down, is that a heap? Well, no, it's 2 grains. What are you talking about? Put another one down. No, not yet. Well, keep going through this process. At some point, you say, whoop, whoop, hold it, that's it. Now that's a heap. Well, the difference between heapness and non-heapness is 1 grain. That is, the heap is already evident in the single grain there. So, Ham keeps saying moment upon moment, pattering down like the millet grains of, waiting for that to build up to a life. Presumably, that's a statement about wholeness, an entire life. But each of those moments is itself already a full and complete life. You can move from there to little portions of narrative, to fragmented humans, which are already a life. You don't need to deal with a whole, the entirety there. So, one way or another, there's no issue of Beckett trying to solve this conundrum the way Bergson does with some of the Eliatic paradoxes. But he's exploring the aesthetic possibility of these kinds of ideas. That there is no whole, that all you have are fragments, portions, yet that is already a reflection of the whole. The idea of the whole, the idea of the heap, is already in the single grain of millet. This is not Beckett's invention. Philosophers through antiquity have dealt with this. Beckett just finds the intellectual conundrum interesting and looking at how it might manifest itself in art. And I think, it finds itself in works like Not I, where you have only the essential fragment of the body in a language deteriorated, whether through physical injury, some kind of a phasic incident, or whether it's the standard feature of language that it has a failing or failed system of communication. Finally, for performance, it doesn't matter whether she has had a stroke or is a phasic one way or another, or that this is the best that language can do to represent a condition. What we get is the performance, the aesthetic version of that. And to anticipate another of your questions, Asijit, does that change the nature of affect of the work of art? And the answer is yes, of course, it has to. We respond differently, understanding those major defects in human beings and in the primary system of human beings.
Right. So in the middle of the book, you mentioned Harold Pinter, who used a wheelchair performing Krapp's Last Tape, or let's say the performance in the Endgame project by Dan Moran and Chris Jones, both with Parkinson's disease. So are you suggesting that these texts offer physically dysfunctional bodies a scope to exhibit themselves? Because we do know that public sight and a site to perform are crucial factors for bodies that face locomotive and or cognitive challenges?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon of late, that as the theatrical world opens up, as we're dealing with colorblind casting, genetic, gender fluidity. We're also opening up the stage to ability possibilities for people with ability issues to be on stage. And we find more and more producers casting actors with disabilities in certain roles. There's a famous production of Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie, where Laura is in a wheelchair. That is, what is a limp or some sort of deformity in her leg is depicted much more directly in a wheelchair on stage. And I'm sure Tennessee Williams, wasn't intentionally developing roles for disabled, and I think the case with Beckett as well. But as the theater opens up, more and more actors find themselves, or finding the possibility of representing themselves in these works. So the Endgame Project, for one, where people have terminal diseases. There are all sorts of people being attracted to these Beckett texts, which gives them the opportunity to express their inner selves through Beckett's work. They are doubtless experiencing a different affect performing in these works. And audiences can't but feel that difference in their own affect, their own response to that. Now, what the final meaning for that is, where that is going, certainly Harold Pinter's depiction of Krapp's Last Tape in the wheelchair got fabulous reviews. Obviously, you have to remove things like slipping on banana skins and things of that nature. But as an image of constriction, and although Krapp is more or less a whole figure, he is trapped in various ways. In his room, in his mind perhaps, in his autobiography, in his tapes. There is a sense of constriction about that. And so many of Beckett's plays, this sense of constriction or even claustrophobia plays this central role. And I think Pinter in a wheelchair plays into that.
Right. So if we imagine a person with paraplegia in a wheelchair, or let's say witness a Jess Storm with Tourette's syndrome acting not I on stage. So we inevitably see theater as an inclusive and embodied space, one that is very biological and especially contingent in nature. So my question is, could we have a completely different kind of effect emanating from such a theatrical space?
I think undeniably. What I would like to see is some comparisons. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing productions like Not I played by a series of actresses. I mean, I think there's a level of these short pieces that is yet to be explored. It happens sometimes. I tried to do a little of this with a production I did in London a few years ago called Breath, Text, Breath, in which we produced breath twice in the play. And I did a production in a museum some years ago where breath was produced periodically but we haven't moved yet. I would love to do an evening of not eyes with 3 different versions, 4 different, you know, as many as we can, and not all exactly with the same visual imagery. So change the actresses, disabled, totally able, all sorts of possibilities, so that we get a variety of experiences in these works. I mean, I think these shorter works, there's always been a problem what to do with these shorter works. Even when Beckett was alive, he sometimes objected to grouping some of them because this play doesn't go with this play, and the like. But I would like to explore multiple productions in a single evening of the same play, maybe with various directors, maybe with the same director, with different visual landscapes. You know, more and more as we move into our enforced electronic theatrical age, because of the pandemic, as more and more people are trying to figure out how to use this medium for what used to be live performance. I think there are all sorts of things you can do with these issues, with fragmentation, disembodiment, disabilities, and the like. I did a production some years ago, again, in another museum, that was based on my earlier production of What Where, which has been taped for television. And there's a kind of interesting version of it on YouTube with Beckett watching that production and making some comments about it. But what I did in the museum was to show that production on 6 different TV screens asynchronously, so that 3 minutes in, the production starts again at an adjacent television, and they're running concurrently but asynchronously, and we did that 4 times. So it was something of a string quartet out of sync. It doesn't all start at the same time. In some senses, it comes close to what happens in quad, although there it's simple movement. But I think these kinds of multiples and disjunctions change the affect of these productions. So you have fragmented, perhaps illusionary, hallucinogenic figures in a time-fractured creation. I'd like to do more of that stuff. Someone find me a producer.
Right. So, however, we, taking the cue from you, however, parallelly, we also see this tendency in Beckett to disembody and attack theater by threats from ghost-like figures, for example, Godot or a boy from the Endgame, or the voice in Ajo, that could invade any moment and end the play instantly. If Godot comes, the play can't go on. So, how to make sense of this contradictory stance of solidifying corporeality and simultaneously diffusing material bodies?
I mean, all I can say is echo Beckett's line at the end of What Where, make sense who may. Well, I mean, one of the first things I say when I'm teaching Beckett, don't expect me to explain it all to you. That's not the function of this kind of art, so that we all have the same idea about what is being read or what is being performed. Beckett refused to perform that role, to say, well, this is really about somebody I saw A, B, or C, and that's what the play is about. Beckett steadfastly refused to do your job for you, which is to respond to the work of art and make what sense of it you can, without saying this is the way it should be framed. Now, I found the problem even in performance because Beckett directed his television plays himself. And that becomes a standard of performance. I decided to break with that. Recently, I did another performance of But the Clouds. That's on YouTube as well. But the Clouds, which is very different from Beckett's, in part, well, for multiple reasons. One, it was directed so that we could do both a live stage production with video built in and an entire video production. Very different in concept from Beckett's. And part of the justification is I too want to explore the possibilities of this work. I don't want to treat Beckett's direction as freezing the piece forever in this one production. So I've been trying to break out of that, but you don't always have possibilities for doing that. I've been very lucky. The people in Poland have given me these possibilities up until this year, which international travel was impossible. But in the back of my head, I want to do Ghost Trio in that way as well, with different music. I have a musician lined up who plays various kinds of Tibetan instruments. And to see what happens when we make those kinds of changes, the kind of production we can get with those kinds of production. Somehow, if Beckett is always breaking down limitations of genre, I hate to feel that we're stuck in certain genres because he did this kind of production. I was ambivalent about that when I edited two of the theatrical notebooks. I tried very hard to suggest that we are not suggesting, and Beckett is not suggesting, that this is the only way that this play can be done. But there's something to be gained from understanding how Beckett saw this work.
Right.
So that's where I am these days, both as a director and a scholar.
Right. And moreover, what do you think of Beckett's unwillingness to utilize the entire body of the stage? So along with the characters doubting their own visibility, or always at the point of invisibility, we find the stage vanishing too. So the stage is rarely seen in its entirety, only lighted parts where solely organs enact their narratives. For example, Not I.
I think if you go back historically, one of the intriguing things about Eleuteria is how a good deal of the stage gets pushed off the stage. There is a physical clearing of the performance space in that play. And the notion that Beckett would stop at that point, seems unsupportable. I have made an argument that begins the clearing of the space we will see finally in Godot. And we will see diminution of space and elimination of much of that space subsequently. So I think, I don't want to suggest a direct progression in Beckett's work, but I think there's a continual movement toward Anatole Godot, pretty much entire bodies, although Lucky is degenerating, Pazzo is degenerating, Pazzo goes blind. I guess that's an optical degeneration at very least. His memory is failing. The memories of Didi and Gogo are failing already in that work. If you follow that through, there is a kind of logic to fracturing that body. And even in those early works, whether or not they are two people or a single person, Beckett referred to these kinds of characters as pseudo-couples. Whether they're one, whether they're two, these are open to question. By the time you get to Not I, you have no idea what this figure looks like. Is her hair gray? Does she have her hair dyed periodically? Does she wear spectacles? There's very little we know about the physical body, except that in performance in particular, Billy Whitelaw accentuated those lips with makeup. And as the TV production focused more and more on the lips themselves, eliminating much of the stage, eliminating the auditor in that play, Beckett loved the production. So even with the partial figure of Not I, you have almost a full figure on stage in the auditor. Production after production, that full figure begins to disappear, as does the television production, as we are able, the way we cannot on stage, zoom in on those lips.
Right. So let's shift to Lacan for a moment. So when borrowing from Lacan, we say that self too is a verbal construct. Do you think bodies in Beckett are semantic constructs too? And perhaps that is the reason they're always found with disabilities, like a punctuation gone, a syntactical error, or a typographical omission. So because inevitably there's a compensation, there's compensation for the lack of mobility by excessive use of words.
I mean, I think what I like very much about your questions is that you already answered them in the asking. And to almost every question you pose, my response can be, I agree with you. And that'd be an end to it. But I think, what you're doing is what we are supposed to do as readers of criticism and the artworks themselves, is to tease out meaning. I keep telling my even graduate students when I teach theory class, is what I'm teaching really is reading. I'm trying to teach you how to read. And you only think you know how to read. They don't like that. But even with with artworks, I think what Beckett is telling us is that you have a job to do here. You have not only to passively experience this, to allow your neural system to do the interpreting, that it's good when the hairs on your arm stand up, but also you have an intellectual responsibility to engage with the material. And so by questioning ontological wholeness, by questioning the function of language, by functioning accepted generic conventions, theatrical, narrative, poetic. Beckett starts with Echo's bones. There's a line in Watt that says all sound is echo. That puts us on a path to mysterious sounds, but mysterious voices as well. The sources of these voices we hear in the narrative on stage are not necessarily all interior. That's the standard modernist interior monologue sort of approach. But despite the multiplicity of those voices, that's still an image of wholeness. When the voice comes from without, or you can't tell whether it comes from within or without, now we're getting close to Beckett's disembodied world.
Right. So
that disembodiment is not only in the evident images we see on stage, it's a conceptual idea as well.
Right. So since disability studies use the materiality of impairment to reimagine subjectivity, should we then begin all Beckettian texts as reactions to and from partial bodies? So what I mean is, if it is at all possible to complete the hermeneutic process without considering disability in, let's say, Molloy and Malone and the whole morbid bunch as the substrate upon which the entire process of becoming shapes itself.
I mean, the hermeneutic process is another of these conventions that are problematized here. For the process of interpretation, one has to be what? Outside the work? Separate from the work? What if we read Beckett's texts from the inside rather than from the outside? I think this is the problem of wholeness as well. In order to consider wholeness, one has to be separated or outside of that entity to look at it and say, oh yeah, now I can see it's a whole. Otherwise, we will only see parts of it. On the inside, we will only see parts of it. So I'm not suggesting that we discard the hermeneutic process, but I think it's a very different process if we examine ontology, aesthetics, logic, from the inside rather than from the outside. I end creative involution with this kind of suggestion that the way we read Beckett, we may need to read Beckett differently from standard interpretive models that we have. And so we explore what happens if we try to read where we're not separated and outside from a unified artwork, character, but inside that character.
Right. So in an interview with, I read this also with Israel Schenker, Beckett explains that, and I quote, "I'm working with impotence ignorance." Now, disability scholars face one major impediment when reading Beckett through the lens of disability studies. So while disability studies stress on overcoming achievement and inclusion, Beckett's foundations are impotence, defamiliarization, and failure, a kind of failing better, also as you mentioned in your book. So could you suggest a way out of this deadlock?
I can't really, because I have no way of knowing what people who have challenged abilities see in Beckett's plays. If it's an issue that they may see that their participation is an act of overcoming one way or another, certain kinds of resistances, and that may be the case. What I do know is that it's not what we would call part of Beckett's intention to create this kind of experience. I have another essay coming out soon in, I guess, another anthology by Dirk van Hula from Oxford. Some of you may be in that volume as well. I haven't seen the table of content. But I talk about regimes of ignorance, in which I pick up Deleuze's phrasing for talking about what Beckett tells Israel Schenker very early on, that his pursuit is ignorance. And for Deleuze and for Beckett, I think, this is an issue of power and authority. And that statements of ignorance are statements of abandoning the notion of authorial power, textual power, and things of that nature. I do put Beckett in conversation with not only Deleuze, but Foucault as well, since Foucault's critique of power is the one that Deleuze adopts. But it's a notion of seeing all knowledge as part of an embedded power structure. And so there's not so much a direct abandonment of truth, knowledge, as an admission that there's a complicity here with certain power structures, governmental, authorial. Sorry, I just lost my earbud. Governmental and linguistic as well, syntactical constraints that Beckett is working against, I think. I mean, all this is my 2 cents. What is thrown out there is for you to make sense as you can for these issues. And I think, Asijit, you put the issues forward, gave me an opportunity to talk about them. But I quite frankly hope I didn't resolve any of them. I would rather not resolve any of them, quite the opposite. I'd like to continue to open them up, continue to expand the possibility, hermeneutical possibilities, aesthetic possibilities, ontological possibilities. Make sense who may.
Yeah, thank you for your response, Professor Gontarski. So would it be wrong to say that Beckett evokes a kind of thisness or thingness of disabled lives with the help of a pre-symbolic register? So let's say the spasms, the soreness, and the tortures resurrect the pre-symbolic upon the post-symbolic, and that's why there's a problem with language in Beckett?
The easy answer is no, it would not be wrong. Which is why Beckett kept insisting that his favorite word was perhaps. You can pose something, but I'll tell you one maybe last anecdote. When I edited the endgame volume of the theatrical notebooks of Samuel Beckett, Beckett was still alive. And so I had the opportunity to work with him on that, which was a bit of a daunting experience because I'm writing all these notes to the play, and I'm sending them to him for review. And the manuscripts for that are now at Trinity College, so they're public documents for you to do. But Beckett reads through all my annotations, and he's got some kind of big magic marker in his hand and makes a big X at the top of one page equal not intended. And he goes through the notes, putting X's by my commentary, or not all my commentary, but a number of my observations about the play, like extending the chess metaphor and things of that nature. What interested me about that is Beckett didn't say, no, not at all. But he said, not intended. Wasn't his intention. He's not saying it should be eliminated, it should be changed. Just so I know this was not part of his intention. I took that to mean that it's still there. That these are the possibilities, and that non-intended is another version of perhaps. So, in some senses, both in performance and reading and in criticism, Beckett kept out of the hermeneutic process for the most part, not always, but for the most part, kept out of that hermeneutic process. And when he did enter, it tended to be a disaster. That is when he complained about women playing Godot and asked why. He said, they don't have prostates. Well, that may have been a joke. It probably wasn't his most insightful aesthetic. It has a little bit about biology, but that's about all. It doesn't mean that we have urinary tract issues. A particular gland.
Right. So could you tell me about the reason that we have in Beckett the denial of humanism's heterosexist able-bodied personhood? Is that the reason why we never get scenes of a fully functional society? Not even a glimpse. I mean, a whole of Beckett.
I don't know what that would look like. I think in some senses we come closest in Eleuteria. And we have Victor Krapp distancing himself from what appears to be a fully functional society. Its rules are laid out. And they're laid out in terms of genre as theatrical conventions. Now, there may be theatrical conventions of Théâtre Boulevard, Boulevard Theater, and that sort of thing. But Beckett takes a lot of time to explain certain kinds of conventional rules. And, I called that play in Revisioning Beckett a Bohemian Manifesto, as it is a full break with all of those conventions. So if the question is Beckett going back to reconsider all of those? Not at all. In some senses, he's had his say on that issue. And there will come a time when a full major production of that play is done. There have been productions of it, workshops, readings, things of that nature. But I think it would provide an interesting background for considering questions like that you just asked.
Right. So Beckett's texts are brilliant examples of contingent vulnerabilities, especially, let's say, Pozzo's blindness or the physical lessening in the unnameable. And at the same time, they tend to strike at the text's hygienic and sanitized surfaces, with stench emitting from a dying body or bodily secretions. So my question is, does it help to destroy what David Mitchell, the disability scholar, the critic, says that, disability in texts are act as prosthetic limbs that texts pledge to repair. Does it help destroy that kind of metaphor?
I think I have problems with some of the terminology like repair or plumbing and the like, which puts a sort of at least quasi-didactic function to some of these representations. To some of these, I would take out my Sharpie, make a big black X, not intended. How actors or readers feel about this is one thing. Whether or not that should become either the dominant trope or the dominant reading is quite another matter. My own philosophy, tends to be much more Deleuzian in that I like dealing with multiplicities.
Right. So how would you observe Arthur Quessen's remark that the aesthetic nervousness induced by the disabled characters in Beckett takes us to the limits of hermeneutical impasse? So quite ironically, we never find a substantial discourse surrounding disability or physical ailments from the biological point of view in any of Beckett's texts. So what I'm trying to ask is, does the absence make us more aware of its aching presence?
I love your answer. It may have been masquerading as a question, but you've answered your own question. Yes, indeed. I think you've done an excellent job of posing the kinds of issues that we all have to work through ourselves with the limits of our own abilities. The one thing we do learn is that disability is a bit of inadequate term, since we all have limitations on our abilities. Some of us are faster than others. Some of us have better eyesight than others. Some of our brains function better than others. What that point is that those kind of limitations impede our social interaction is another matter. But I think that much of this comes back to Beckett's exploration, essentially, of where we are as a species. And where we are as a species, you remember that Beckett comes out of a tradition where the British Empire and the ideology of empire is still quite dominant. And much of the ideology of empire is built on a kind of social Darwinism, that some cultures and their inhabitants are more fully developed than others. And it has become, to quote Kipling, the white man's burden to help those of lesser development along that evolutionary line. It was the British ideology in Ireland as well as India and the rest of the empire. And the counter argument is, what real evidence do we have of continued evolution to higher and higher better and better species. What Beckett says, when he looks around, he sees the mess. Part of that mess is not seeing humanity developing to higher and higher levels. If you've looked at CNN the last couple of days with reporting out of Washington, you'll see that there's every reason to believe, or at least to question, that humanity is evolving toward higher and higher species.
Right.
There's as much a commentary on Beckett's world as anything we've said today.
Right. So do you think that Beckett's text should be adopted and adapted more by human rights activists? But this question has been bugging me for a long, long time. Because
yes, of course. I mean, what they do with those texts is another matter. I mean, if we try to emblematize them for either world human rights or abilities or gender issues, you know, I would push back to such didactic purposes there. But they're very useful for opening up issues. But to say that this shows that, I mean, somehow, you know, to turn them into metaphors for, I mean, I think one of the most stunning things that Deleuze brings to the fore is his rejection of metaphor as systems of equation. And metaphors are built on the notion of this, you know, equals this, which extends to issues of representation. You know, this represents this, something beyond the work. I think Beckett takes issue with representation as a whole. So looking at his work as a representation of abilities or disabilities, as representations of issues of human rights, I mean, there's no question that what where is about some form of torture, and that there is a almost cavalier attitude toward that torture. Did you give him the works? Yes. And he didn't say it? No. He didn't say what? No. He didn't say where? No. And Beckett insisted on that second, he didn't say where, is not a typo. He said he didn't say where, he said what. And you know, well, where has been used as an example of this kind of human rights issues. And you know, the theater itself. We are at a point now in theater where we're finally getting around to questioning ethics in theater and the implication of critics in that ethical process. That is, whether or not any kinds of abuses are justifiable for the final product, or are there other considerations that come into play? So issues of ethics of human rights, when the Italian court finally overrode the estate's objections to female intendant Godot, they overrode authorial rights, and what they put forth was human rights. And that the victory was a victory for human rights, in the notion that it is not acceptable to eliminate over 50% of the world's population from being able to perform in this play. That's a very similar issue to disabilities and the like. But Beckett's work has already been used thus, to forward agendas of human rights. And more can be done there. More can be done there with disability rights, with gender issues, but also with linguistic issues and the like.
Right, and my last question for the session. So finally, do you feel that all of Beckett detects a continuous presence of abject dependency and is ultimately a quest for care and recognition, which also the disability scholars stress, that it is about care and recognition?
I mean, we're very early in this expansion of disability studies, our understandings of disability studies, and certainly disability studies in terms of Beckett's work. I think we all know that there is a natural affinity there for something to happen, for a way to develop our understanding of Beckett's text. We have been doing that, I think, more through performance so far, but the door is open. You have how many people here today? You have 15, 20 people who can walk through that door. Go do it. I keep saying I'm writing my last book on Beckett, which doesn't seem to be the case. It may be pathological, finally. It may not be a conscious decision. I may be unable to stop. Anyway, it's been very fruitful, and thank you all for showing up what in my time zone is still morning. And I think the subcontinentals here are getting ready for evening meal.
So thank you so much, Professor Gontarski. Now it's open for questions. Does anyone want to ask anything to Professor Gontarski? I think there is one question, Professor Gontarski, from Jonathan McAllis. He wants to ask that you mentioned, he says you mentioned that what Beckett objected to in Pierre Chabert's production of Company was the theatricality of the box on stage. How do you read Beckett's relationship to theatricality and its values? What do you think he took from, or how did he develop the avant-garde theatricality of the early 20th century, he asks.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of his resistance to Eleuteria is it engages many of the contemporary traditions of theatricality in it, including spectators jumping out of their seats onto the stage. But, there is a sense like, depicting the values of contemporary culture, that Beckett is finished with that, and we can move on to other things. I think in many cases, there's a decided anti-theatricality to Beckett's theater. People monologue, for example. It's not only that people don't often get shot or physically attack each other. They do in Eleuteria, but that's another issue. Beckett's interests seem to be in areas other than theatricality. The chandelier that falls in Phantom of the Opera, for example. And I never asked Beckett why he told Chabert to eliminate that moving stage within a stage. I just made a guess. And it impacted Chabert a good deal because he spent over 2/3 of the production budget building that contraption. And then they had nothing to do with it. Beckett had pretty clear ideas about how this should be performed. And he put them forth only because Chabert insisted that he come to rehearsals. This was the first run through. Beckett was quite willing to allow him to do whatever he wanted. But as long as he's there, and Chabert says, well, what do you think? Beckett is going to tell him. And he did. And, we can look at some of these later works and say there's a kind of theatricality built into play, for example. But generally, you can find as many examples of his shunning theatrical effects, one way or another. There are probably ways, Ohio impromptu, that you can make reader appear and disappear, but it's all done linguistically there. I'm not sure that I answered the question, but I think there is a genuine resistance to the theatricality that he saw, in London and in Dublin's musical stage. And I think his resistance to opera, which he never liked, was to its spectacle, its emphasis on spectacle. Eleuteria is the last play he does that features spectacle. Moving stage, This is how the National Theatre of London makes its living, with productions on massive moving stages and enormous flies where stuff is coming down and going up all over the place. That's not Beckett's theater. Or at least it's not the theater Beckett's interested in himself.
Right. Thank you, Professor Gontarski. So James Martle is asking that, thinking about Beckett's understanding of bodies and fragmentation and of Deleuze's notion of fascism as both molar and molecular tendencies embodied in all of us, do you think that Beckett's work could be utilized today as an affect Deleuzian antidote vis-a-vis the new forms of fascism we see them today?
Again, what I object to is words like use. Can this be used to accomplish certain kinds of social agendas? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But we are certainly in an era where fascistic thinking has been on the rise. How much of a blow we can do in the United States these days is another matter. But Beckett is in Germany in 1936. Hitler's in power from 1933. He's there when art is being confiscated, where he cannot get to see the pictures he wants to see because they've been declared degenerate. We are still dealing with the after effects of that action. That is, a lot of these artworks that were confiscated were sold on the international market to major museums around the world, which helped finance the German military machine. And we're still tracing those implications. The Museum of Modern Art in New York is implicated to some degree. But Beckett, is in Germany, where the effects of that kind of fascist totalitarian rule over aesthetics was coming more and more into play. And so his unsurprisingly, in Paris during the occupation. His sympathies were with the oppressed, certainly not with the oppressor. I'll tell you another strange anecdote. I begin to worry that I'm falling into what was Sigmund Freud's best pun ever, when he talked about the elderly falling into their anecdotage. I was at the Bellagio Foundation in Italy, the Rockefeller Foundation at Bellagio, some years ago, with a very diverse group. And I was at dinner with a couple of South American psychiatrists. And the male said to me very simply and straightforwardly, didn't know much about Beckett, but he said, you know, this Beckett, is he kosher? And I thought, what a strange question. But the more I thought about it, the more I saw it as a statement about where Beckett stood in 1939 to 1945 on these key central issues, when so many of intellectuals in the Anglo-American Franco tradition had strong sympathies with National Socialism. T.S. Eliot, William Butler Yeats, you know, were all supportive of certain, and there's a very uncomfortable strain in modernist thinking that is linked to support for this kind of fascism. Beckett was entirely on the other side of that issue, even in his homeland, where he was accused of being Jewish, by the way, because Jewish meant undesirable, generally, you know, and part of his reason for going first to Germany, then to France, was to escape that kind of attack. So the answer was, yes, Beckett was kosher, or at least he had sympathies in the right place, and risked his life for it. You know, it's one thing just to have closeted sympathies, but to work even what he called Boy Scout stuff for the resistance, you know, would have put him in mortal danger, even though he had an Irish passport, never became a French citizen, and Ireland declared itself neutral during the Second World War. Not Ireland's greatest moral hour, but they couldn't bring themselves to side with the British on any issue. So they were neutral. Beckett was technically safe for being a national of a neutral country, but not if he worked for the Maquis, which he did.
So we have one more question from R&D Angelus, who's asking, how do you explain Beckett's pervasive representation of old age in his oeuvre? Do you think his view of aging women was influenced by the memory of his mother's Parkinson's disease? And does it make sense to analyze his representation of old age in relation to late style?
I love these questions, which contain their own answers. It makes my job very easy to say yes. You know, but certainly, you know, that came into play. I mean, he was with his brother as he was dying and clearly deteriorating from lung cancer. He was with his other relatives, aunts and mother, as they were deteriorating and dying. All of that had an impact. You know, whether or not we're dealing with representing those people or not is perhaps the wrong question to ask. But those are the images that are part of Beckett's intellectual stockpile, his archive. When Derrida turns his attention to archival studies, he sees the subconscious as an archive as well. That the archive is not just book papers in the library, is that the features of a subconscious are those of an archive, and such images. And there are all sorts of images. I mean, they're mixed with all, incredible other images. You have to remember that Beckett grew up with his hometown on fire in the midst of local civil war. All these things became part of Beckett's archive. And so they merge, part of the feature of archival studies, part of the interest of the archival studies is that very often one's discoveries are serendipitous. You're looking around for something and you find something that you weren't looking for, but turns out to be so much better. You tend to stumble on things. And so stuff pops out of the archive. Sometimes when you're eating madeleines and dipping them in herbal teas, sometimes in other strange ways. But those images are certainly part of the archive. And, Beckett, we all know Beckett did extensive thinking about Proustian memory, about the most useless kind of memory, which is those things you try to call up intentionally, and most useful memories, those that appear when you dip in your Madeleine.
Okay, so are there any other questions? Then we'll end the session. Okay, I don't think there are any other questions there. So thank you so much, Professor Gontarski, for sharing your profound understanding of the disabled characters in Beckett, of performances by differently abled actors, and the nuances of Beckettian language. I hope we have such sessions with you again in the near future. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone for being so patient and cooperative.
For arranging this, thank you all for taking time out of your days to take part in this seminar, I believe, and usually you have posted these to YouTube?
Yes, they'll be on YouTube in a couple of days, yes.
So this stuff will be available at some point.
Yes.
Thank you. I feel like having a Madeleine now.
Thank you, bye-bye, thank you, thank you.